Good afternoon. Can you hear me at the back? Is that excellent? Chris, do you want to just say something?
Not really. Oh, my Lord.
Could you hear that too? Good. I meant to say, incidentally, that at the end, could you please stay seated so we can get Chris out, because the whole purpose of this is to sell his book, so he's got to sit there and sign it. If he's not there, he won't be able to sign it. So that would be very
Make
kind.
it sound like I'm being bundled out.
Oh, you will be bundled out. Could I also say, once we get to the audience participation bit of this, I assume someone's going to turn some light on so I can actually see some of you, and if you could stick up a hand, there is somebody who's going to rush around with a mic. So please don't start asking your question until you get the mic. I think that constitutes the end of the announcements.
The intimations, as they used to say in church.
Indeed. Well, I mean, it's not as a churchman, of course, that I'm talking to you, but as a politician. And you've had a very long, distinguished parliamentary career, but you...
It feels very odd hearing Oliver Letwin say that to me.
Well, you're
very, very odd indeed.
You're still having one.
Oh, yes, I am still having one.
Many sympathies. But it's an unusual career in the sense that you've been mainly occupied, I think it'd be fair to say, until at least very recently, with, anyway, after leaving Tony Blair's outfit, with procedure and constitution and parliament itself and so on. And I wanted to begin by asking you, which do you really now see yourself as primarily interested in the substance of politics and government, or as somebody who's one of the great living experts on Parliament and who really cares about parliamentary process, which is what this book is all about?
Well, I want to change the world.
Very good.
And I think the best way of doing that is through democracy. And I hate autocracy and nationalism and populism. And so I want the parliamentary democracy to function well, because it's essential to be able to do all the other things. So for me, I say in the book several times that, on the whole, people don't come to your surgery, and in the Rhondda anyway, and say, dear Chris, I want to talk to you about secondary legislation. They don't do that. But actually, it is about the disposal of power. And so all of these things matter. Weirdly, on Question Time last night, we had a very brief debate, because David Davis didn't really understand what he was talking about.
No partisan remarks.
Well, because we were talking about the ministerial code, and he said, well, it's a very long legal document, and I wanted to say...
Well, it's not legal, it's not very long, but...
No, exactly, apart from that. The point is that I'm trying to make is that all of these things matter. But there's another dichotomy in me, which is that, as you just pointed out, sometimes I can be extremely partisan, but sometimes I also look across the chamber and I go, there are people over there that, Liam Fox, for instance, I disagree with him about just about everything under the sun, but he's done an awful lot of really good work on pointing out the problems of Russia for a much longer time than most other people on that side of the house, and likewise he's done a lot of work on Down syndrome. So, and of course you and I were in a WhatsApp group for quite a while.
We were. We'll pass over that in silence. Now, this book, which I hope you're all going to buy, has an enormous amount in it, and we could talk about it forever, but we're not allowed to. So, I've divided your book. I hope you won't regard this as a terrible travesty, into two parts. Not that they are really two parts in terms of the sequence. One is about, if I can put it that way, ethics, the ethics of Parliament. And the other is about the Constitution and how it ought to operate. And so I thought I'd start with your ethical thesis, and then we'll move on to the Constitution, if that's okay. So far as the ethical bit is concerned, I mean, you say some things which I think are almost entirely uncontroversial, like not all MPs are wholly bad, and some things you even go so far as to say have got better in your time, our time in Parliament, like people imbibing slightly less alcohol. Certainly when I arrived, an awful lot of it went on.
Not because you arrived.
I don't think so. But you also say, which is unfortunately also uncontroversial, that there's really quite a lot of bad behavior. And so far, it's all true but not very interesting. And that's when it gets interesting, because you then start saying some quite controversial things. And the first thing you say that I wanted to draw attention to is about the aim. What kind of aim should we have? Should we try to have perfect MPs? And you quote a very remarkable man called the Reverend Michael Roberts, who I think ran Westcott House.
He did.
And you say...
Which is a theological college in Cambridge.
Indeed. And you say, he said to you, look, there's no point loading parents up with guilt by trying to get them to be perfect parents, or even good parents. It's far better to help them aspire to be good enough parents. And you go on to say that that's what we should seek in MPs, not perfect, not even necessarily good, but good enough. And the question I wanted to ask you is, do you feel confident that it shouldn't really just be the electorate who decides whether MPs are good enough? Because you go on to construct, and we'll talk about in a moment, a whole series of suggestions about how to ensure that MPs are good enough, rather than just trusting to the electorate to get rid of them if they're not. What is it that persuades you that the electorate is not enough as a means of ensuring that MPs are good enough?
Ian Paisley.
Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, no, I'll expand on that. So Ian Paisley is an MP in Northern Ireland. He has a very safe seat under the system that we have.
This is Ian Paisley Jr.
Ian Paisley Jr., yes, who's a sitting MP. He was found to have taken and not declared and engaged in paid lobbying on behalf of, I think it was the Sri Lankan government or the Singaporean government, I can't remember which. And he was suspended from the House for, I think, 6 weeks. Which should have led to a by-election, but the people of his constituency said, yeah, whatever. So that's why I would say that, the sword of Damocles does not swing evenly, depending on which kind of seat you have. My seat in the Rhondda has been Labour since 1885. I know MPs who have pretty much taken their seat for granted because they've got such a big majority and it's been safe for Labour or Conservative or whatever for such a long time. So that's why I think that's number one. Secondly, I think I just want the parliamentary estate to be a place where everybody is safe to work. And that's just the same as any other workplace. And the problem of just leaving it to the electorate, or for that matter to local political parties, which is another traditional route that we've had, is that the party will always want to brush it under the carpet, any malfeasance of any kind, because otherwise it tells against the party and it's a problem for them. Bit like the Church of England and the Catholic Church and so many others, everybody's always wanted to sweep things under the carpet. And secondly, it doesn't address the change of attitude that needs to happen in Parliament. Again, some of this has changed. So I tell a bit in the book that when I was first arrived, I arrived in 2001. And in the early days then, I was an out gay man. And for some reason, older, not out gay men felt that it was their privilege of office to be able to touch me up. And I never felt I could do anything about it back then, because if you told the whips, they would just say, "Oh dear boy, I'm sure we can sort this out." That was a Labour one. And I saw I remember very vividly seeing a young female MP being hugged in the division lobby by a drunken older male MP, feeling her bottom, and it was just, and I could see her face over his shoulder, and she was just petrified. And that today, if it happened today, we would deal with it. And that's why, when I started writing the book last December, 19 MPs had been suspended in this Parliament for a day or more, or had left Parliament before there was a report into their misconduct. When I handed it in, there were 20. When we published, there were 22, and now there are 25. And I think there'll be more before the end of this Parliament. And part of that is because we now do take sexual harassment and bullying seriously in the parliamentary estate. But it's just about us being a good employer. One of the things that's always seemed weird to me, strangely, a lot of people who go into politics haven't ever actually employed anybody. And suddenly, they have to employ 4 or 5 members of staff. They've never done adverts or, they've never done interviews. They don't know any of the standard things that you would do if you were in a big company or worked in a local authority or anything like that. And yet we let them just plough on. We give them £200,000 a year to spend on staff. Well, just a very simple thing would be to say, right, sorry, you can't employ anybody with taxpayer money unless you have been trained in HR sufficiently to be able to do proper interviews. All staff are, all posts are advertised publicly, and there's another person in the room when you do the interview. I don't think I've told this story before, but one MP said to me in the last year that he only employs gay men, he's gay himself, because otherwise how on earth could he trust them? And I was just, I don't know what the word is for shocked in this particular circle, because I was just thinking, well, that's illegal, apart from that. You can't just employ somebody because of their sexuality, just as you couldn't not employ them because of their sexuality. So there's a whole world of things that need to change in the way we do our business in Parliament.
Okay, well, that's a pretty persuasive answer. So, instead of the electorate, you recommend a single parliamentary code, bringing all the codes together, and you recommend a single, I think you call it, independent national commissioner. And I guess, and this commissioner is meant to enforce the code and hence achieve all the effects you've just been talking about so eloquently. I guess the question that naturally occurs to me is, how do you ensure that this commissioner doesn't become much more powerful than the electorate and isn't biased and doesn't step over the bounds of his or her proper role and become an engine of political change, which would obviously be catastrophic?
Well, because I'd appoint Oliver Letwin.
No, sweet of you to say so, but I wouldn't take the job.
No, indeed. And you wouldn't get it anyway.
No, I wouldn't.
Because all the Conservatives would refuse. Right. Anyway, we'd be fine, but no, serious point. So if I can just go back to the first bit you said about all the different codes, because I think this is an important point to make, which is that as things stand at the moment, we have the Parliamentary Code of Conduct, which we've rewritten and we've tightened up a bit in the last year. We have a behaviour code, which is about bullying and sexual harassment and things like that. We have the ministerial code, which is completely separate. And then we have various other rules that apply to MPs as well through the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, which pays MPs and provides them with all their expenses and things like that. So you've got all these different codes. And sometimes it's almost impossible to know which one is the right one to go to. And there's a terrible element to this, which is you might have noticed that there are now, I think, more MPs who have no political party because they've been suspended from the whip in their party than there are Liberal Democrats.
Oh, no, I hadn't noticed that.
Yes. I mean, not more than there are Liberal Democrats in the country.
No.
But, I mean, in Parliament. And because what happens is that if somebody's not happy with that, they might make a complaint to the police. The police don't pursue it. They then go to the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, and they might not pursue it, either for whatever set of reasons, or they might go to the Standards Committee, and that doesn't get pursued by the Commissioner either. And so then they go to the party. And because the party's had a serious allegation, it immediately removes the whip. And that person is then in limbo and it can be for months and months and months. So that's my argument here is that there are too many different codes. That is unfair to the public. Most ordinary members of the public have no idea of this kind of smorgasbord of different fish laid out on a piece of sourdough. So they don't know where to go to complain. And likewise, I don't think it provides fairness for MPs.
No, but let's take that for granted, that it's a good idea to have a single...
Well, it's not taken for granted,
No,
is my point. So I have to make that argument first. Yes.
But I'm buying
and then the danger is, obviously, yes, you could have somebody who is far too powerful. And that's why I think you have... I don't think you should be able to suspend somebody from Parliament, having been elected by the voters, without Parliament finally ticking the box to say that that is a right decision. So I would still have that commissioner work to a committee, which should have lay members of the public and members of Parliament on it. I think that that's an important mix.
So the commissioner, in your view, should be, so to speak, a prosecutor and not a judge?
Yes, exactly.
Right. And the committee would be the judge?
Yes, and then you would have an appeal as well. So now what we have for a standards complaint, so since 1695 it's been an offence to engage in paid lobbying. Since the Orphans Act of 1695, the Orphans Act sounds like it was a really good thing, but it was actually the City of London trying to take all the money out of the orphans' charities and spend it on their own banqueting. And they paid the Speaker of the day, I think, 1,000 guineas to help it go through Parliament. And he was thrown out of Parliament because that was termed to be paid lobbying. It was the same with Owen Paterson. That's what we found him guilty of. So that's a standards case. The Commissioner investigates, sends a report if he thinks that there's been a breach of the code. The Standards Committee, which has 7 lay members and 7 members of Parliament, adjudicates and decides on a sanction. And now, after that, the independent expert panel, which is chaired by a former High Court judge, Sir Stephen Irwin, is the appeal. And then the final ticking of the box is the House of Commons, which is a simple straight up and down vote without a debate. Now, I think that is fairness for everybody along the whole process, and I would just bring everything else into that same system. So, for instance, you may recall that there was a bit of a debate about whether Boris Johnson had lied to Parliament. And I recused myself from chairing that. I should have been chairing it, but I recused myself from chairing it because I had said, not just once, but like about 100 times on any broadcast opportunity that was available, that I thought he was patently a liar, and everybody knew he was a liar, and that was one of the problems. But that went to the Privileges Committee, which is just the 7 MPs. Now, I think there's no reason why lay members couldn't sit on that as well. And in actual fact, that would have given the MPs on it, 4 of whom were Conservatives, and I doff my cap to those 4 Conservatives because they were under terrible, phenomenal pressure. I think they would have given them more cover if there had been 7 lay members on the committee as well.
Okay, so the guard against the commissioner becoming a sort of political agent is that they're the prosecutor and there's this court and then there's an appeal court and then finally Parliament itself. So actually I want to take you precisely to the
And and then after that, of course, if you're suspended for 10 days or more,
then there's the electorate.
Subject to the Act,
in the end,
and then there is the electorate.
Yeah.
And the electorate in Wellingborough are going through this at the moment. There's a recall petition open at the moment for 6 weeks into whether Peter Bone should...
Yes, which might, of course, in the case of Ian Paisley, nevertheless have kept him in situ.
Well, in his case, it did. I mean, he remained because the voters didn't even bother turning up for the...
Indeed.
Yes.
If they
he could have stood again, yes, indeed.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, but I want to take you actually to the precise sort of case that you raised, not specifically Morris, but the question of misleading Parliament, because you recommend, I think it's probably the single sort of toughest thing you recommend in the ethics part of the book, that there should be a criminal offence, a statutory criminal offence of, and I think you call it, knowingly, intentionally or recklessly misleading Parliament. As I say, I don't want to go into the Boris case, whether he did or didn't qualify under that, but somebody...
I think we know that...
Anyway, somebody might knowingly, intentionally or recklessly mislead Parliament. And in such a case, you would have...
I don't think I am in favour of that. I don't think I am. No, what I am in favour of, I point out that there are 2 proposals out there, one from Liz Savile-Roberts and another from a Labour MP, which argue for that. You're now going to read out
Just
the
before we
sentence
go on, can I read you what you said?
I'd hate to have misled the room.
You say...
knowingly, willingly, and...
I would also introduce 2 new offences, and your second one is refusing to give evidence to a parliamentary committee. That's separate. But this one is knowingly, intentionally or recklessly misleading Parliament as a government minister and refusing to correct the record when required to do so by the Office of National Statistics or the National Commissioner for Ethics and Standards.
Right, so that's the second part of it. Right, yes, now I do agree with myself.
Good. That at least is an advance.
It is. Well, Oliver, you've had moments when you've not agreed with yourself.
Many.
No,
spent my whole life not agreeing with myself, but you haven't. You've been quite consistent.
Sometimes. No, the point I want to make is that we've had since 2007, as you know, a system for a minister correcting the record.
Yes.
And this is quite important because, of course, you make mistakes. Sometimes you say 5 million when you mean 5 billion. Fine. It happens, you know, we all make those kind of mistakes, and sometimes it's because somebody's typed it out wrongly for you and you blah. So we've had a system, the minister can just go to Hansard and say, can you correct it? And then why it's important is because the original online and printed version says, and the minister corrected it on such and such a date. So the original doesn't even stand. And oddly enough, only a few weeks ago, we made this available to all members of Parliament as well. Another change since the book came out, which is a good thing. One of the things I argue for in the book. However, quite often, ministers point blank refuse to correct the record, even when, for instance, the Office of National Statistics writes to them and says, what you are saying is untrue, you must stop saying it. Robert Jenrick, Suella Braverman repeatedly being told this and repeatedly refused to correct the record. And I think that at that point, there are 2 options. My preferred one is that you would, if you had refused to do so within 28 days, you would stand suspended from the House for more than 10 days and therefore automatically potentially face a by-election. I think the moment somebody refused to do that, it wouldn't happen ever again. The alternative is then that you go down the route of having a criminal offence. Now, I know the dangers of a criminal offence, which is, you know, it's the Americanization of politics, because politics in America is endlessly, you know, one of the reasons you can't be a politician in America unless you're really rich is you have to be able to pay for lawyers all the time. Everything is contested in law all the time. And I don't really want to go down that route, but I do worry that when you and I were in Parliament at first, it was around about 45% of people thought that MPs lied all the time. It's now at 82%, according to opinion polls. And the danger for democracy is really quite real, I think. There may be lots of people who won't vote in the next election because they're just so fed up with it. And so we've got to sort our act out.
Well, it sounds as if you're sort of havering between
I am.
An offence and the courts and a more automatic system for forcing a by-election in the case of, or forcing the possibility of a by-election in the case where somebody...
What I really want to do is force ministers to correct the record, or MPs to correct the record. And I mean,
yes.
I've had to correct the record, I don't know how many times.
Yes, but now let me take you to, and forgive me, this isn't intended as a partisan item at all, but when I was shadowing Gordon Brown as Chancellor, I thought there were times in his budgets when he very consciously misled the House, not in the sense of lying to the House about something, but in the sense of presenting a budget which sounded like it was X, and it turned out on a couple of days' inspection later that it was Y. And this became a sort of form of art. Now, I don't actually think there was anything improper about it. I mean, I didn't think it was a very good way of conducting his budgets, and I told him so, but I didn't think there was anything improper about it. I think it would qualify in your as knowingly, intentionally, or at least recklessly misleading the House. Would you really want to see the Chancellor of the Exchequer up before the beak?
Well, as you know, most of my book is quite nuanced. I don't, you know, when we talk about second jobs and things like that, I don't get out the whipping stool kind of thing, and I'm not putting everybody in a pillory, but basically because I'm not a fundamentalist in my politics or in my religion, and I'm very distrustful of those who are. But Theresa May put it rather well not long ago when she said, of course, there are times when, as a politician, you choose your statistics rather carefully.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that. That's perfectly fine. I mean,
and that wouldn't count as...
It wouldn't count.
Misleading.
But I mean, on Tuesday, we had this... I asked Rishi Sunak in the House about homelessness because of the Suella Braverman thing saying that, homelessness is a lifestyle choice. And I said, bearing in mind that a significant proportion of the homeless are veterans and people who've had brain injuries, do you agree with Suella Braverman? And he then talked about homelessness, and he said lots of things which, very strictly speaking, are accurate, but they are so selective that they give a misleading impression.
Well, that's very much like Gordon's budget.
And I'm afraid we have to live with that.
Yes, I agree with you. We do have to live with it. Are you sure that you'd be able to live with it if you had this offence?
Well, that's what we'd have to tease out if we were introducing it through the legislative process. But yeah, that is...
It would need some very careful drafting.
Obviously, and that's the danger.
You think
on the whole,
ultimately...
however, I wish politicians wouldn't do this. Select so carefully.
So do I, but Chris, they do. They have. Since Demosthenes, it's been going on a long time.
Well, I wasn't around.
No, neither of us were, but we have good records.
I know, but so you see, Oliver, I think we've got too used to this. I really do. And
I happen to agree with you.
I know. Well, stop disagreeing with me then.
Different. That's different from having a criminal offence.
Yes, it is. I get that. It's just, I mean, every time. One of the problems that we've got in the Parliament at the moment is that quite a lot of people have used this phrase, one bad apple, and I think they think it means that there's only one bad apple, so that's fine because the rest of the barrel is fine. And that's not what the proverb means in Chaucer. It means one bad apple spoils the barrel because blight spreads. And so the classic instance for me is, actually, there were much more significant lies that Boris Johnson told. My favourite one is when he's asked about, am I allowed to mention Brexit? When he was asked about what's the benefit of Brexit, he always says, well, it meant that we were able to do the vaccine rollout faster than anybody else. It's completely untrue. For a start, we didn't do it faster than anybody else. We were the second slowest in Europe and still have the second slowest of any country in Europe. More importantly, we were still in the EU when we started the vaccine rollout. And indeed, every country in Europe had a special dispensation which had been decided 10 years earlier, and government ministers in the UK had announced it several times to be able to use vaccines in specific sets of circumstances such as this. But it's not just that Boris said it. Rishi Sunak will say it. If you had him sitting here today and you asked him what's the benefit of, he would say exactly the same as Boris. So that's why we have to stop people doing this eliding of truth. That's my argument.
Well,
and I know you're going, good luck, Chris. But I want still to be, and I will get it wrong many, many times, I'm sure, and people will tell me when I've got it wrong.
Well, we've explored that enough, and I understand entirely the thesis. It would be interesting to see if the Labour government brings it in.
Don't be cynical.
We'll have a way of finding out. I'm not cynical at all, actually. I'm just worried about things that can't be enforced. However, let's move on to your constitutional thesis, because the book isn't just about ethics. It's also about how we ought to have our constitution. I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that your fundamental thesis is that government, as opposed to Parliament, has become too unconstrained, too powerful, too little accountable, particularly to Parliament. Your remedy is to make it more accountable to Parliament, I think it's also fair to say.
My remedy is to take back control.
Yes, for Parliament.
For Parliament, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know how this is going to sit, should I become a government minister. But
Well, I'm going to come on to that in a moment, as you're now a shadow minister. It's very good that you've written the book before that.
it's a
But
bugger, actually.
you don't just say this and you don't just argue it, you actually put forward some specific proposals. And one of them is that you want, I won't read you the thing, I'm sure you'll agree, it is what you say, that you want to end the government's control of the order paper, which is an item that you and I have both had some experience of. That would mean, well, in fact, you propose quite a sort of qualified way of doing that.
Can I put the argument first?
Yes,
I'll tell you
sure.
why. So my argument is that in the British system, it is basically, to quote ABBA, the winner takes it all. As long as you are the Prime Minister and you have a majority in government, in Parliament, even though that may never actually be expressed in a vote, but you've won the general election or you become the leader of the largest party or the party that can command a majority in the House of Commons, you can do pretty much what you want. Certainly every penny of expenditure is entirely up to you. We never have votes on expenditure. We don't actually have a budget in our system in the sense that anybody else would recognise it. We have a budget statement.
We're going to come on to that in a
legislation. All right, sorry. But you get to decide when Parliament sits, how long it sits for, what it debates every single day that it sits, when it's prorogued, when we have a general election, how many people you want to put in the House of Lords, what amendments end up getting voted on or not voted on. It's quite extraordinary the degree of control you have. And I think it's one of the reasons that we do legislation badly in the House of Commons. And you can tell that we do it badly because every year the House of Lords carries thousands of amendments. And everybody says the House of Lords does it so much better. Well, what's the difference? The government doesn't have control of the order paper in the House of Lords. So I think it's a relatively simple thing, and it's in common with nearly every other country in the world, apart from the ones that we spawned. It is that you have a committee of the House which decides, you know what, we've got a national security bill. It's not just going to have 2 hours on the floor of the House to debate amendments. This is what actually happened earlier on this year. 2 hours when the government had tabled amendments that were longer than the bill itself. 2 hours, and we're not going to have 2 hours, we're going to have 2 days to discuss these because these need to be looked at properly, which is what happened in the House of Lords.
Right. So it's a clear argument for having control of the way the House of Commons does its business lie outside the government.
Yeah.
And you then go on to specify how this should be done, and you say, we should end the government's exclusive control of the Commons order paper and timetable, handing it over to a cross-party business committee elected by the whole House, which would consider and propose the future business of the House, guarantee time for government and private members' legislation, and ensure enough time is allocated for all important and controversial legislation. So
yes.
That's your cross-party committee. Now, I take it this would be a committee like the other committees of the House in the sense that the ruling party would have a majority on it. And there are whips. And as you and I both know, the whips would try to make sure anyway that the majority members, the members from the ruling party, voted in favour of a timetable which was exactly what the government wanted. How do you avoid this problem?
I don't see that as a problem, actually, because the bit of Parliament that works best is the select committee system. And try as whips might, they find it difficult to control select committees these days. If somebody is elected by the whole House, rather than just by the government side, to be the chair of a committee, they have an authority which they didn't used to have. And maybe it would only shift the dial a little bit, but I think it would be a
significant... You think it would be a real difference?
And I know you agree with me, Oliver, because when you were a government minister, you were part of a government that said that they were going to implement it.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I do agree with it.
Yes, all right.
And indeed, I proposed it.
All right, there we are.
And the objection that was always raised was that the whips would anyway control it.
I know, but...
And you feel that that's moved on enough with the select committee system now to guarantee, or anyway, make it likely that...
Well, if you look, honestly, if you look at the Foreign Affairs... I've been on the Foreign Affairs Committee until recently. I did 6 years on it. We produced reports that I don't suppose any government would have been happy with, but they were independently sourced, well researched. They were argued from first principles and all on the basis of evidence that came before us. And I think that that is a model that would end up surviving.
Right. Well, good. Now we come to the thing you leapt ahead of me and mentioned. No, perfectly legit. Which is the question of whether we should, as you propose, give the House of Commons line-by-line control of Her Majesty's government's expenditure. If you like, I can read you the text, but I think you'll remember that you propose that should indeed happen, that Parliament should actually, like the House of Representatives in America, go through the government's expenditure program line by line and be able to amend it.
Yep. It's worth just knowing that the system for agreeing finance and expenditure in Parliament is, A, very complicated.
It's incomprehensible.
Yes, I was going to say, I'd be amazed if you could find 5 MPs who understand it.
I can testify that you can't, because when I was Shadow Chancellor, I tried to find anyone who could understand it. I couldn't find it.
I think I do actually understand it, but anyway.
If so, you're unique.
But one of the extraordinary things, for instance, is that you can't, just let's take one example of expenditure, which is the police grant every year. The only person who can, under our rules, the only person who can table a motion to increase or to spend money is a government minister. So by definition, an opposition member cannot say, let's say it's £500 billion, isn't enough, we want to make it 600 billion because we don't think we've got enough police officers. You can't even table that amendment. You can only table something to cut it. Which leaves the opposition, if when the police grant comes forward and everybody's saying we've not got enough police officers, it leaves the opposition with a simple choice. You either vote for it or you vote against it. Voting against means you're voting against any budget, and then you get accused of defunding the police. Well, that's just a nonsense.
So that's the argument for the line-by-line control.
Yeah.
I just want to put to you, I mean, I mentioned the States advisedly because what it's led to in the States is
Gridlock.
Indeed, well, gridlock is one problem, but we could perhaps get over that. But the other problem is pork barrel politics, that people are sent in to bat, so to speak, to get a line for some extra money for their congressional district or their state. Do you not worry about that?
Oh, Oliver, if you'd been in this Parliament, you would know all about pork barrel politics. Seriously, it's one of the things.
You think it's happening anyway now?
If you look at some of the new funds, like the Levelling Up Fund and the Towns Fund, they're meant to be levelling up. You would think that, therefore, the money would go to the poorest, the most needy areas in the country. The Towns Fund, and each of the applications has to be supported by a named MP now, right? And it's a competition. And the minister decides, knowing who the MP is who's asked for the money. We've had instances where Tory MPs have complained that they've been told, if you don't vote the right way on such and such piece of legislation, you won't get the school in your constituency. I think that's corrupt. And it's corrupting, which is more and more worrying, because it means that ministers have got used to this and MPs have got used to it. I have a tunnel in the Rhondda. We need £20 million to open it up so that, and it's a former railway tunnel. It belongs, as it happens, or even though it's in Wales, it belongs to the Department for Transport in England. If you opened it up, it would be it'd be the longest cycle tunnel in Europe. It'd be a great tourist destination. We've got all sorts of plans for it, blah, blah, blah. We need £20 million. It should really be decided on the basis of whether that is the best project, in my local area. But that's not how it'll be decided. It'll be decided on whether I personally lobby all the ministers.
But wouldn't this get worse with line-by-line approval?
It couldn't get worse. I honestly, the simplest, I think it's the Dulux Select Committee, which is local government one, it advocated that none of these monies, that when these monies go, or these bids for money go up to ministers, they should be blind. That is to say, they shouldn't know what constituency it is in and who the Member of Parliament is. And ministers insisted that they still wanted to know, which is why you end up with £19 million, or whatever it is, going to Rishi Sunak's constituency, despite it being the 480th poorest. In other words, the 220 richest.
But, okay, maybe it couldn't get worse. but wouldn't you be institutionalizing the very system that you disapprove of?
No, there is a danger of that, but I think there are bigger dangers at the moment, which is that we don't do any proper scrutiny of expenditure at all.
And you think...
We just have this day when we bundle all the
efforts
in.
I take that point, but you believe that that would outweigh the disadvantage?
I think so. But where I completely accept is that that's not the kind of change that you could do overnight and you would be a simple thing to do.
Okay, on that note...
It's at least a kind of 7 or 8 year project.
I'm seeing people wanting to hand over to the audience here. Just before we do, I want to ask you one last question about current affairs, so to speak, that's highly relevant to your book. You recommend reform of the House of Lords. I was amongst those who tried to reform the House of Lords and failed. There's been a long line of people who've tried to reform the House of Lords and failed. Do you think a Labour government will actually reform the House of Lords in the way that you propose with a largely elected assembly?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, there we go. It's very nice to see you all at last. And I hope by now you will see that this book is full of interesting things of many kinds, and that Chris is an extremely articulate exponent of them. And it's over to you now. Who would like to ask the first question? Yeah.
Extremely interesting, and thank you very much indeed. Fascinating and just so commendable that you've given such attention to it. And my question is completely other. It is that climate change and our use of resources and the pollution of the planet is just so urgent, so important. What needs to be done to bring it to the fore on our agenda?
I think it's the defining issue for our times. And I think that because I remember I was a minister in Gordon Brown's Foreign Office for about 5 minutes, and I went to Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea, and I met this amazing woman called Gladys, who's from the Carteret Islands, which is a series of small islands off Bougainville, which is off Papua New Guinea. And she was explaining to me that there used to be 12 islands, and because of the rising seawater, then there were 10. And then there were 11 again because the water drove through the middle of one of the other islands and split it in half. And in fact now I think they're down to about 1,500 people living on the Carteret Islands, and most of others have had to go to Bougainville where they don't own their own land. They have to work for other people. There is alcohol, and their life has completely changed. And if we think that we have a problem with migration patterns at the moment, if we don't take climate change seriously, we will have extraordinary environmental degradation, which will lead to millions of people moving. I think nearly all the lowest, some of the poorest people in the world live in the lowest lying land, and the most vulnerable people, therefore, to having to move. So you're right, and people need to ask questions in sessions like this. People need to vote for people who will take it seriously. Yes, indeed. That's what I meant by, so as the water in Thailand, for instance, advances every year, something like 100 meters, it takes another, these figures will be wrong, but it's something like it takes another 100,000 people out of an area where they've got clean drinking water, and so on. So we may end up with wars for drinking water in the future rather than for oil.
Horrible thought. Yes, sir.
Thank you for such an intelligent and thoughtful debate. Going back to the point about one bad apple, how can you fix Parliament when you have people who have been utterly corrupt over the past 5-6 years, and no punishment is ever going to be meted out to these people? Mentioning no names.
Well, I wish you would mention the names, but I think... well, the electorate will do something, and I know what you mean. I mean, I find it very, very galling to think that somebody who, the first Prime Minister in our history to have been found to lie to Parliament, and and now through the COVID inquiry, we find it's much, much worse even than we knew, is rewarded with a multi-million-pound book deal and, multi-million-pound deal with the Daily Mail and GB News and all the rest of it. And I do worry that British politics is in danger of being very severely tainted by a kind of Trumpian way of doing things. And all we can do is we can try to fight it in the ballot box, and we can try to fight it with better arguments. One of the things that really wound me up was not only, you've got to remember how bad that moment about Owen Paterson was. He'd been found to engaged in an egregious case of paid lobbying, and at the very last minute, the government supported a motion to get rid of the existing standards committee with its lay members and a Labour chair, and appoint a new committee to be with a Conservative majority and a Conservative chair to completely rewrite the rules at the very last minute in favour of a named individual. That's what you get in Russia. It's not what you get in the British system. That's not justice of any kind. It's the polar opposite of it. And 250 MPs voted for it. That's what worries. And then 250 MPs, pretty much the same set, refused to turn up to vote on whether Boris Johnson had lied to Parliament. And then you had all the stuff about a kangaroo court and all the rest of it. We're in a worrying time. We're in a worrying time.
On that happy note, who's next?
What is your assessment of the COVID inquiry? Is it moving in the right direction? Is it likely to produce a fairly coherent assessment of what was right and what was wrong, and how a government should properly conduct itself during a pandemic on that scale?
Well, I don't know whether Oliver would agree with this, but I think, well, first of all, I think our inquiry system nearly always takes far too long. And so by the time it's ended, everybody's kind of given up the ghost and forgotten what it was all about in the beginning. So I worry about that. They're also very, very expensive, and I just wonder whether there's a reform that we could do to make that better. I think there are two things that we need to get out of this. First of all is an understanding of what good government looks like. And, you could argue that Tony Blair took us down a direction of sofa government, and that was not good either. And so I would argue that we need to get back to a more corporate idea of a cabinet government and proper governance within government. And then secondly, there's the question of whether we did the right things during the pandemic. And what I haven't really assessed, and I haven't really seen much assessment of, is whether we made the right decisions at the right time or not. There's perfectly legitimate questions about, for instance, why was it that pubs were opened again before schools were? And I know from my own family that, kids really suffered during that period. Lots of them didn't socialise enough, and they found it more difficult to socialise when they get to universities and things like that. So there's two different things that we need to learn from it. We've certainly learned what bad government looks like, feral, brutal, and useless government looks like.
We're in danger of verging on the
No, we're not.
political, ish. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Robert Jenrick earlier. One wonders how he survived as a Secretary of State, having granted a planning permission in extremely diffident circumstances that anybody else would consider corrupt, and is now not only a minister, but considered as an alternative to the Prime Minister, and indeed is on our television sets on an almost daily basis. How on earth did that happen without there being an alarm in Parliament?
Well, quite. And this goes actually back to my point about if you have a separate ministerial code and a separate parliamentary code of conduct, As things stand, the Parliamentary Commission for Standards is not allowed to investigate something when somebody is acting as a minister. Well, that's clearly ludicrous. And I couldn't understand why, on the Dominic Raab thing, if Dominic Raab had done to his parliamentary staff what it was found that he had done to his office staff in the Foreign Office, he would have been removed as an MP, let alone as a minister. So that's why, again, I think it's still a mess. We've got far too many different elements and lots of things fall through the cracks.
It's an interesting case, that, actually, of the need for the codes to be connected with one another. Yes, madam.
My question is, and the questions so far reflect this, why are the image on your front cover all men in suits?
One of them is actually a woman wearing a suit. Can I get away with that? Not really.
They're blind, deaf, and dumb.
Yes, speak no evil, see no evil,
Yes.
is the point, yes. And there's no green either. It's a very well-made point.
Bullseye. Yes, madam.
Thank you. I noticed that the subtitle of your book is Why We Need to Fix Parliament. I wondered whether what we need to fix is a system rather than just Parliament.
Oh, sorry, yes, that is what the book is about.
Yeah.
It's definitely about fixing the system. I mean, because there's lots of different elements. One of the reasons I was always in favour, for instance, of a fixed-term Parliament is because if you have snap elections, you get people elected who haven't been through any kind of due diligence in their local political party. That you may remember there was an MP called Jared O'Mara. I think he's out of prison now. But he was a Labour MP. And, I mean, he didn't have the personal wherewithal to be an MP. We should never allow, we, the Labour Party, should never have allowed him to be a candidate. And I was talking to a government chief whip, a Conservative chief whip. I'm not breaking confidence because there have been so many in recent years, you won't be able to identify which one it is, who said to me, the trouble with this Parliament is that there are just too many people who got selected suddenly and should never have been selected to fight in a parish council, let alone get into Parliament on the rising tide of a particular... I mean, how on earth do we get to a situation where the choice in this country was between Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson? I mean, that's part of the problem with the system, isn't it? But were you going to say something else?
Chris,
I was just going to finish my question,
Oh,
if
sorry.
I may, which was, what do you both feel about PR?
So I'm in favour...
Just before you answer that, can I just, I mean, just in answer to the first part, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that your book has recommendations for fixing Parliament, but part of the point of that is to enable more accountability to Parliament to work properly so that the whole system is then fixed.
Yes, that's the argument.
I just wanted to bring that out because I think the book is actually quite carefully structured that way. Sorry, PR.
And I should also say that I regularly say in the book that I haven't written this book because I think I'm a particularly good MP or a particularly good person and I want to lecture everybody else about how to be better. Quite the reverse. And it may be because I've been through so many scrapes myself politically that I have a more nuanced approach to some of the questions that were raised. But I personally support a more proportional system. The question is about what kind of proportional system, because I love being MP for a geographical area that is my patch. I used to be a priest in the Church of England, and it feels remarkably similar going into Morrison's today as an MP as it did when I was the priest in the local parish, because people come up to me with their often very heartfelt problems. And a lot of the things that I fought on, like acquired brain injury, are things that have come from my own constituency experience. But you have to have a more proportional system so that every vote counts. And that's why I would go to something like the German system with additional members. The problem with a pure PR system is then the people who select the candidates and the MPs in the end are the leaders of the political parties. And that takes the power into an even tighter cabal than we presently have. And I know this from, I've done a bit of work in Spain, and I know that no, I won't tell that story. It's too long, basically.
It's interesting. And you recognise, presumably, that the effect of that might be to have frequent coalitions, but you regard that as advantageous rather than disadvantageous.
In the end, the big political parties in our system are coalitions already. The Labour Party the Conservative Party is a coalition between authoritarian and libertarian versions of conservatism, and the Labour Party is a coalition between Social Democrats and Socialists. So, and perhaps we should all be just a little bit more honest about that, would be my preference for a system, and I'd be very happy to form a government with Oliver.
Yes, well,
we call it the Buses and Trains Discussion Group.
Oddly enough,
that's what the WhatsApp group was called. We called it that. Am I allowed to tell this?
I don't know whether you're allowed to tell it.
We called it that because we set up this WhatsApp group of the rebels in his party and my party over Brexit, and we didn't want anybody looking over our shoulder in the chamber to see that we were talking about Brexit, so we called it the Buses and Trains Discussion Group.
These are the deep secrets. I have to say, I have actually come to think that coalition is quite a good way of governing, but we shouldn't dwell on my thoughts. It's yours that count here. Yes, sir, back there.
We might best find out whether our current MP might again support the candidature of Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
I'm going to be partisan for a moment because I can't resist this sentence. And I'm quoting Alistair Campbell. Alistair Campbell said at a book festival, another book festival down the road, he said, any party that gives you Boris Johnson followed by Liz Truss should never get re-elected again. No, but the real problem sorry, you can applaud that if you want, but actually, the more serious point is, I think for Rishi Sunak, he actually has to renounce the Johnson-Truss combo, and he can't. That, I think, is the fundamental problem with the Suella Braverman issue that we've got at the moment. And look, you know the story of Pandora's box. Everybody always refers to Pandora's box as like it's a terrible thing because Pandora's box is opened and all the evils come out and so on. But actually, the story of Pandora's box says at the end, what is left in the box is hope. And I just think that that's a really important. I've tried to say that that's an important part. You could argue that we got rid of Owen Paterson in the end. The system did get rid of him. It took quite a lot of heavy lifting. But we did succeed in the end. Jacob Rees-Mogg sort of did an apology, though I describe it as being about as graceful as a flatulent hippopotamus in the book. But I think there are lots of politicians who really, really do care about standards in public life, but they need to know that voters care. Because you will have seen politicians go on television saying, oh, this is all Westminster tittle-tattle, it doesn't really matter, voters don't care about this. Of course voters care about the cost of living crisis, the state of the NHS, whether they get to see a GP and all those things. But actually you don't get to change the world unless you have a parliamentary democratic system that really, really functions. So if there's one thing I'd ask you all to do, it is to write to your MP and say that you care about these things.
Good.